Before the sun rises over the hills, before the noise of the world begins to press in, there is a quiet place where the heart can breathe. This is where King David often began his day, not on a throne, not with a sword in his hand, but with his soul turned toward God. When we read the Psalms, we are invited into these early hours of David's life, moments when the world was still silent, and his heart was awake before the Lord. David understood something many of us forget. The way we begin our morning shapes the way we live our day. Before decisions had to be made, before enemies appeared, before responsibilities weighed on his shoulders, David chose to seek God first. He did not rush into action. He did not rely on his strength or wisdom. He lifted his voice to heaven and aligned his heart with the presence of God. In the Psalms, David speaks often of the morning. He talks about crying out to God at dawn, of presenting his prayer, and watching expectantly. These were not empty rituals. They were intimate encounters. David approached God with reverence, honesty, humility, and trust. His prayers were not perfect, but they were sincere, and because of that, they carried power. Not power rooted in words, but power rooted in relationship. As we walk through how King David prayed to start his day with God, we are not chasing a formula. We are learning a posture of the heart. David's mornings teach us how to seek God before seeking answers, how to praise before we ask, and how to trust before we act. His prayers remind us that every day, no matter what it holds, begins best in the presence of the Lord. So as you listen, imagine yourself standing with David in those early hours. Let the noise fade, let the heart settle, and let us learn, step by step, how a man after God's own heart began his day with God. Number 1. David began his day by seeking God early. When King David opened his eyes in the morning, his first instinct was not to check what dangers awaited him or what tasks demanded his attention. His first instinct was to seek God. Before the sun fully rose, before the city stirred, David turned his heart toward the Lord. This choice was not accidental. It was intentional, deeply spiritual, and rooted in his understanding of who God was in his life. In the Psalms, David speaks clearly about this habit. He says that in the morning he lifted his voice to God and he waited expectantly. This tells us something powerful. David did not just pray quickly and move on. He prayed, and then he waited. He believed that God would hear him, respond to him, and guide him. Morning prayer was not a formality. It was the foundation of his day. David knew that seeking God early meant placing God first. Not after plans were made, not after problems appeared, but before everything else. He understood that when God is first, everything else finds its proper place. His battles, his leadership, his emotions, and even his fears were all shaped by those early moments in God's presence. Think about how different David's life was from ours, yet how similar his mornings could be. He faced enemies, betrayal, pressure, and uncertainty. Some mornings he woke up hunted. Some mornings he woke up burdened by responsibility. Yet instead of allowing fear to speak first, he allowed God to speak first. He did not let the urgency of the world dictate his spirit. He let the voice of God set the tone. There is something deeply humbling about this. David was a king, a warrior, a leader of a nation. Still, he recognized that without God his strength meant nothing. By seeking God early, David was saying, Lord, before I do anything today, I need you. Before I speak, before I decide, before I act, I need your presence. David's morning prayer was also an act of dependence. It was his way of acknowledging that each day was a gift from God. He did not assume he would succeed on his own. He did not trust his experience alone. He trusted the Lord who had carried him through the past and would walk with him into the unknown. And this is where David's example becomes deeply personal for us. When we wake up, our minds often rush ahead to responsibilities, worries, deadlines, and fears. David shows us another way, a way that says pause, seek God, let him meet you at the beginning. Because when God is the first voice we listen to in the morning, his peace has a way of staying with us throughout the day. Seeking God early did not mean David always felt strong. It meant he knew where his strength came from. In the quiet of the morning, David aligned his heart with God's truth, and that alignment gave him clarity, courage, and peace to face whatever the day would bring. This is how David began his day, not with confidence in himself, but with confidence in God. And that choice, made again and again at the start of each day, shaped the life of a man after God's own heart. Number 2. David started his day with praise, not request. When David came before God in the morning, he did not begin by listing his problems or demanding solutions. He began with praise. Again and again in the Psalms, we see David lifting his voice to honor who God is before asking for anything God might give. This reveals something deeply spiritual about David's heart. He understood that prayer is not primarily about changing circumstances. It is about aligning the soul with the truth of God. In the stillness of the morning, David reminded himself of God's greatness. He spoke of God as his rock, his fortress, his shield, and his refuge. These were not poetic habits without meaning. They were declarations of faith. By praising God first, David was setting his focus on the character of the Lord, rather than the challenges of the day. He chose to look upward before looking around. Praise did something powerful in David's morning prayers. It shifted his perspective. Instead of waking up overwhelmed by what lay ahead, he grounded himself in who God had always been. God was faithful yesterday. God was powerful yesterday. God was merciful yesterday. And because God does not change, David trusted that he would be the same today. David's praise was also deeply personal. He did not speak about God in distant or abstract terms. He praised God as my God, my salvation, my strength. This kind of praise comes from relationship, not religion. David was not trying to impress God with eloquent words. He was expressing love, reverence, and trust from a heart that knew God intimately. Starting the day with praise also prepared David's spirit. Before facing people who might oppose him, before dealing with injustice or danger, David filled his heart with truth. Praise reminded him that God was bigger than his enemies, stronger than his fears, and closer than he sometimes felt. In praising God, David found stability. It is important to notice that David's praise did not depend on his circumstances. Some mornings, his life was peaceful. Other mornings, he was surrounded by threat and uncertainty. Yet his praise remained. This tells us that praise was not a reaction to comfort. It was a decision rooted in faith. David chose to honor God even when his emotions were unsettled. By beginning his day with praise, David was also guarding his heart against pride. As a king, it would have been easy to wake up thinking about his authority or accomplishments. But praise redirected his attention. It reminded him that every victory, every breath, and every opportunity came from God. This kept his heart humble and his spirit grounded. For us, this is a powerful lesson. When we begin our day with praise, we are not denying our struggles. We are placing them in the right context. We are saying, God, before I ask you to move in my situation, I want to acknowledge who you are. Praise clears the noise of fear and makes room for faith. David's mornings teach us that praise is not the result of a good day. It is the foundation of a faithful day. By lifting God higher than his worries, David stepped into his day with confidence rooted not in circumstances, but in the unchanging nature of God. Number 3. David surrendered his plans to God each morning. As David stood before God in the early hours of the day, he did not assume that his plans were automatically aligned with God's will. Instead, he surrendered them. This is one of the most revealing aspects of David's morning prayer. He understood that even good intentions need to be placed in God's hands. Power, position, and experience never replaced dependence on God in David's heart. In the Psalms, David often speaks about committing his way to the Lord. This was not a one-time decision. It was a daily posture. Each morning, David brought his path, his choices, and his future before God. He recognized that without God's guidance, even a king could walk into error. Surrender, for David, was an act of wisdom, not weakness. David's life was filled with decisions that carried great weight. As a leader, his choices affected an entire nation. As a warrior, a single decision could mean life or death. Yet instead of trusting his instincts alone, David entrusted his direction to God. Morning prayer became the place where his will was softened and reshaped by God's purpose. This surrender was not passive. David did not pray and then sit back without responsibility. Rather, he prayed so that when he acted, he would act in alignment with God's heart. He asked God to make his way clear, to lead him in the right path, and to keep him from walking in pride or self-reliance. Surrender was how David prepared himself to act wisely. There were mornings when David's plans were interrupted. Sometimes God led him in a direction that felt uncomfortable or unexpected. But because David had already surrendered his will, he was able to obey. His prayer had already said, "Lord, not my way, but yours." That made obedience possible, even when it was costly. David also understood that surrender brought peace. When his plans were in God's hands, he did not carry the burden alone. He did not wake up trying to control outcomes beyond his power. He trusted that God was already at work in what he could not see. That trust settled his heart and quieted his anxiety. For us, this part of David's prayer life is especially challenging. We often begin our day with plans already fixed in our minds. We ask God to bless what we have decided instead of asking him to direct us. David shows us a better way, a way that says, "God, here is my day. Shape it, redirect it, use it according to your will." Surrendering our plans does not mean losing purpose. It means finding the right one. David's greatness did not come from insisting on his own path, but from walking the path God revealed, step by step. Each morning, surrender positioned him to live with clarity, humility, and trust. This is how David entered his day, not gripping control, but releasing it. And in that release, he found guidance, peace, and the confidence that God was leading him where he needed to go. Number 4. David asked God to examine his heart. As David prayed in the morning, he did not stop at praise or surrender. He went deeper. He invited God to examine his heart. This is one of the most vulnerable and powerful aspects of David's prayer life. David understood that the greatest battles were not always external. Many were fought within the heart through motives, thoughts, desires, and hidden intentions. In the Psalms, David openly asked God to search him, to know his heart, and to reveal anything within him that was not pleasing. This kind of prayer requires humility. It means standing before God without masks, without excuses, and without self-justification. David did not pretend to be perfect. He wanted to be pure, and he knew that only God could truly see what lay beneath the surface. Morning was the perfect time for this kind of prayer. Before the pressures of the day could harden his heart, David allowed God to soften it. Before emotions were stirred by conflict or responsibility, he asked God to cleanse his inner life. This shows us that David cared deeply about who he was becoming, not just what he was doing. David understood that unchecked sin, pride, or bitterness could quietly shape his actions throughout the day. So instead of ignoring his inner life, he addressed it early. He brought his thoughts before God. He brought his attitudes before God. He brought even his hidden fears and weaknesses into the light of God's presence. This was not a prayer of condemnation. It was a prayer of trust. David believed that God's correction was rooted in love. He knew that when God revealed something in his heart, it was not to shame him, but to restore him. This gave David the courage to pray honestly, without fear of rejection. There were mornings when David's heart was heavy with regret. There were times when he knew he had failed. Yet he still came to God. He did not run away in guilt. He ran toward God in repentance. He understood that a clean heart was more valuable than a flawless reputation. By asking God to examine his heart, David was choosing transformation over comfort. He wanted his inner life to reflect God's holiness. He wanted his thoughts to align with truth. He wanted his actions to flow from a heart that was right with God. And he knew this kind of alignment had to begin in prayer. For us, this is a powerful invitation. Morning prayer is not only about asking God to bless our day. It is about allowing God to shape us for the day. When we invite God to search our hearts, we are choosing honesty over appearance, growth over denial, and relationship over routine. David's willingness to be examined by God is one of the reasons his prayers carried such depth. He did not just want God's hand, he wanted God's heart. And each morning, by opening his inner life to God, David stepped into his day with clarity, humility, and a renewed desire to walk in God's ways. Number 5. David prayed for guidance and wisdom. As the morning light began to rise, David often stood before God with a simple but powerful request: guidance. He knew that wisdom did not come from experience alone, nor from position or strength. True wisdom came from God, and because of that, David consistently asked the Lord to teach him, lead him, and show him the way he should go. David's life was filled with moments where guidance was essential. He faced enemies who were unpredictable, allies who were sometimes unfaithful, and decisions that carried long-lasting consequences. Yet instead of rushing forward with confidence in his own judgment, David paused in the morning to seek God's direction. He wanted to move only when God led. In the Psalms, David speaks about God making his path straight and instructing him in the way he should walk. This reveals a heart that was willing to be taught. David did not approach God assuming he already knew the answers. He approached God as a servant, eager to listen. Morning prayer was not just a time to speak, it was a time to hear. David understood that guidance from God required attentiveness. It meant quieting his own thoughts and being receptive to God's voice. This is why the morning hours were so important. Before the noise of people and responsibilities filled his mind, David created space for God to speak truth and direction into his life. Wisdom, for David, was not abstract knowledge. It was practical, daily guidance. It influenced how he spoke, how he responded to conflict, and how he led others. By praying for wisdom at the start of the day, David was preparing himself to act with discernment, rather than impulse. There were times when God's guidance led David into patience, instead of action. Other times it led him into courage and movement. What mattered was not the direction itself, but the source of it. David trusted that God saw what he could not see and understood what he could not fully grasp. This kind of prayer required faith. David had to believe that God would guide him, even when the answer was not immediate. He had to trust that God's timing was perfect. Morning prayer became a declaration of dependence, an acknowledgement that without God's wisdom, even the strongest leader could be led astray. For us, David's example challenges the way we approach our days. We often ask for success, protection, or comfort, but neglect to ask for wisdom. David shows us that wisdom is essential. It shapes every other blessing. When we seek God's guidance first, we are better prepared to walk faithfully through whatever the day brings. David began his day by asking God to lead him, not because he was weak, but because he was wise enough to know his need. And by doing so, he stepped into each day with confidence, not in his own understanding, but in the guidance of the Lord. Number 6. David declared his trust in God before facing the day. As David prepared to step into the responsibilities and challenges of each day, he made a conscious choice to declare his trust in God. This was not silent belief hidden in his heart. It was spoken confidence. In the Psalms, David openly proclaimed that God was his refuge, his shield, and his stronghold. These declarations were often made in the morning, before the day had a chance to test his faith. David understood the power of declaring trust. When fear tried to rise, he spoke faith. When uncertainty surrounded him, he reminded himself of who God was. Declaring trust was not about ignoring danger, it was about acknowledging that God was greater than any danger he faced. Many of David's mornings were marked by uncertainty. There were times when enemies pursued him, when betrayal threatened his safety, and when the future was unclear. Yet instead of allowing fear to dominate his thoughts, David anchored his heart in trust. He declared that his life was in God's hands and that God was watching over him. These declarations were deeply personal. David did not speak about God in distant terms. He said, "I trust in you, and you are my God." This kind of language reflects intimacy. David was not placing his trust in an ideal or a concept. He was placing his trust in a living God who had proven faithful time and time again. Declaring trust also strengthened David's courage. By speaking faith before action, he entered his day with spiritual confidence. He reminded himself that he was not alone in his battles. God was with him. God was for him. And that truth shaped how he responded to every challenge he encountered. It is important to understand that David's trust did not mean he felt no fear. Rather, it meant he chose not to be ruled by fear. Morning prayer became the place where fear was confronted and replaced with faith. By the time David faced his enemies or responsibilities, his heart was already anchored in God's protection. For us, this practice is just as meaningful. The day ahead may hold uncertainty, pressure, or conflict. When we begin our morning by declaring trust in God, we are reminding our souls that God is still in control. We are choosing faith before circumstances speak. David's declarations were not empty words. They were grounded in relationship and experience. He trusted God because he had seen God's faithfulness in the past. And each morning, by declaring that trust again, David renewed his confidence for the day ahead. This is how David faced his days, not with anxiety, but with assurance. He stepped forward knowing that whatever came, God would be with him, and that trust, declared in the quiet of the morning, carried him through the noise of the day. Number 7. David remembered God's past faithfulness. In the quiet of the morning, David often looked back before moving forward. He remembered what God had already done. This act of remembrance was not nostalgia, it was faith-building. By recalling God's past faithfulness, David strengthened his confidence for the present day. Throughout the Psalms, David recounts moments when God delivered him from danger, lifted him from despair, and guided him through uncertainty. These memories were deeply personal. He remembered being protected as a shepherd, strengthened as a warrior, and sustained as a king. Each remembrance became a reminder that the same God who acted before was still at work. David understood that forgetting leads to fear. When the mind forgets God's faithfulness, it begins to magnify current problems. So in the morning, David intentionally reminded his soul of truth. He spoke to his own heart, calling it to remember the Lord's goodness and mercy. This practice anchored David's faith. Even when the day ahead looked uncertain, remembrance gave him stability. He did not measure God's faithfulness by his current circumstances. He measured it by God's unchanging character and proven history in his life. Remembering God's faithfulness also protected David from despair. When discouragement tried to settle in, memory became a weapon. David could say, "God has helped me before, and he will help me again." This gave him courage to face challenges without losing hope. David's remembrance was often connected to worship. As he recalled God's deeds, praise naturally followed. Gratitude filled his heart. He did not just remember what God had done, he thanked God for it. This transformed memory into worship and fear into faith. For us, this is a powerful reminder. Our lives are filled with moments where God has been faithful, yet we often rush into the day without recalling them. David teaches us to pause, to remember, to let God's past work speak into our present situation. Morning prayer becomes richer when we include remembrance. It reminds us that our story did not begin today. God has been walking with us long before this moment. And just as he carried us then, he will carry us now. David's habit of remembering God's faithfulness strengthened his trust and steadied his heart. By beginning the day grounded in memory, he stepped forward with assurance, knowing that the God who was faithful yesterday would remain faithful today. Number 8. David prayed with honesty, not perfection. When David came before God in the morning, he did not try to sound perfect. He spoke honestly. His prayers were not carefully polished performances. They were real conversations flowing from a real relationship. In the Psalms, we see David expressing joy, fear, confusion, hope, and even deep sorrow, all in the presence of God. David understood that God was not impressed by flawless words. God desired a truthful heart. So David brought his true self into prayer. When he felt strong, he said so. When he felt overwhelmed, he did not hide it. Morning prayer became a place where David could be fully known and fully heard. There were mornings when David woke up burdened by fear or grief. Instead of suppressing those emotions, he brought them before God. He spoke about his tears, his sleepless nights, and his inner turmoil. This honesty did not weaken his faith, it deepened it. David trusted God enough to be vulnerable. David's honesty also extended to his questions. At times he asked God why circumstances were unfolding the way they were. He did not pretend to understand everything. Yet even in his questions, David remained anchored in trust. He questioned God without turning away from God. This kind of prayer requires courage. It means believing that God is safe enough to hear our struggles without rejecting us. David knew this. He understood that God's love was not conditional on his emotional state. Because of that, David could speak freely, without fear of condemnation. Honest prayer also brought healing to David's heart. When emotions were expressed instead of hidden, they lost their power to control him. Morning prayer became a place of release. By pouring out his heart before God, David entered his day lighter, freer, and more focused. For us, David's example is deeply comforting. Many people feel pressure to pray the right way, using the right words. David shows us that sincerity matters more than structure. God listens to the heart, not the performance. When we pray honestly, we invite God into the reality of our lives. We allow him to meet us where we truly are. David's prayers remind us that God welcomes authenticity. He is not distant. He is near. By beginning his day with honest prayer, David stepped into his responsibilities with a heart that had already been heard. And that honesty strengthened his relationship with God, shaping him day by day into a man after God's own heart. Number 9. David committed his words and actions to God. As David prepared to step fully into the day, he did not leave his prayer behind in the quiet of the morning. He carried it forward by committing his words and actions to God. David understood that faith was not only expressed in prayer, but lived out through daily behavior. So he asked God to guard his speech, guide his actions, and shape every response he would make. In the Psalms, David often prayed that the words of his mouth and the meditation of his heart would be pleasing to God. This was not an abstract idea. David knew that his words carried weight. As a leader, his speech could bring peace or conflict, encouragement or harm. By committing his words to God in the morning, he was choosing to speak with wisdom, restraint, and integrity throughout the day. David also recognized how easily emotions could influence actions. Anger, fear, or pride could rise quickly in moments of pressure. Morning prayer became the place where he surrendered his reactions before they were tested. He asked God to keep him from speaking rashly or acting impulsively. This showed David's awareness of his own weaknesses and his dependence on God's strength. Committing his actions to God also meant seeking to honor God in everything he did. Whether leading, fighting, worshiping, or resting, David desired that his life would reflect God's character. He did not separate spiritual life from daily life. For David, every action was an opportunity to walk in obedience. There were days when David failed in this. Scripture does not hide his shortcomings, but what set David apart was his desire. Each morning he returned to God with the same prayer, to live in a way that pleased the Lord. His commitment was not based on perfection, but on continual surrender. This kind of prayer created accountability. By committing his words and actions to God, David was inviting God into every moment of the day. He was saying, "Lord, walk with me. Shape how I speak. Guide how I act." That awareness changed how he lived. For us, this lesson is deeply practical. Many of our struggles come not from lack of prayer, but from forgetting our prayer once the day begins. David teaches us to carry our morning devotion into our daily conduct. Prayer becomes the foundation for how we treat others, how we respond to pressure, and how we make decisions. By committing his words and actions to God, David stepped into his day with intention. He did not drift through life spiritually disconnected. He walked consciously with God, and that commitment, renewed each morning, helped shape a life marked by faith, humility, and obedience. Number 10. David found joy and strength in God's presence. As David spent time with God in the morning, something powerful happened within him. His soul was renewed. Joy returned. Strength was restored. David did not come to prayer only to prepare for duty. He came to be refreshed by God's presence. He understood that true strength was not found in physical power or authority, but in nearness to God. In the Psalms, David often speaks about joy that flows from being in God's presence. This joy was not shallow happiness dependent on circumstances. It was deep, steady, and sustaining. Even in seasons of trouble, David could rejoice because his joy was rooted in God, not in outcomes. Morning prayer became a place of restoration for David. When his heart was weary, God refreshed him. When his spirit felt burdened, God lifted him. David allowed God's presence to minister to him before he gave himself to others. This is one of the reasons David was able to endure so much pressure throughout his life. David also found strength in knowing that God was with him. The awareness of God's presence gave him courage. He did not step into his day feeling alone or unsupported. He knew that the same God he met in prayer would walk with him through every challenge. This joy and strength were not forced. They flowed naturally from time spent with God. David did not rush through his morning prayers. He lingered. He listened. He rested in God's presence. And from that place of rest, he found the energy and resolve to face the day. There were days when David's circumstances did not improve immediately after prayer. Enemies did not disappear. Problems were not instantly solved. Yet David still left prayer strengthened. Why? Because his confidence was not in changed circumstances, but in an unchanging God. For us, this is a gentle reminder. Many people begin their day already exhausted, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. David shows us that God's presence is a source of renewal. When we begin our day with God, we are not starting from emptiness. We are starting from fullness. David's joy was not naive. It was grounded in trust. He knew pain, loss, and disappointment. Yet he also knew where to find strength. Each morning, by dwelling in God's presence, David was recentered and re-anchored. This is how David entered his day, with joy that could not be shaken, and strength that did not depend on circumstances. His time with God did not remove challenges, but it prepared him to face them with faith, courage, and peace. Conclusion. When we step back and look at how King David began his day with God, we see more than a routine. We see a relationship. David's mornings were not rushed obligations or empty habits. They were sacred moments where his heart was aligned with heaven. Before his feet touched the path of the day, David sought God early, placing him first before responsibilities or fears. He began with praise, lifting God higher than his circumstances. He surrendered his plans, inviting God to lead where he could not see. He allowed God to examine his heart, choosing honesty and humility over pride. He asked for guidance and wisdom, knowing that true direction comes from the Lord alone. He declared his trust, anchoring his faith before challenges arose. He remembered God's past faithfulness, strengthening his confidence for the present. He prayed with honesty, bringing his true self into God's presence. He committed his words and actions to God, choosing to live out his faith. And finally, he found joy and strength in simply being with God. This is why David's prayer life still speaks to us today. He did not pray because his life was easy. He prayed because his life was demanding. He did not come to God with perfection, but with sincerity. And God met him there, day after day. David's example invites us into a different way of starting our mornings, a way that is not driven by urgency, fear, or pressure, but by presence. It reminds us that we do not have to face the day alone. God is waiting to meet us at the beginning. You may not be a king or a warrior, but you carry your own responsibilities, battles, and decisions. And just like David, you are invited to bring them to God before the day unfolds. When you begin your day with God, You are not just preparing for what you will face. You are being shaped into who God is calling you to be. Let David's mornings inspire your own. Not to copy his words, but to follow his heart. Seek God early. Trust him deeply. Walk with him daily. And allow each morning with God to set the tone for a life rooted in faith, strength, and